17-year-old Devin clutched his boarding pass as he made his way through the busy Atlanta airport. His heart raced with excitement and nerves. This wasn't just any flight. This was the flight that would take him to Los Angeles, where he'd spend the summer working at one of the biggest tech companies in the world. For a kid from a small town in Georgia, this opportunity felt like winning the lottery. He'd worked so hard in school, staying up late studying coding and computer science. His teachers always said he had something special, but Devin never imagined he'd actually make it this far. As he walked toward his gate, people kept staring. Devin was used to it by now. His hair was something people noticed wherever he went. The long, carefully twisted locks fell past his shoulders, each one formed with patience and care over the past 3 years. They weren't just hair to Devin. They represented his connection to his heritage, his spirituality, and his identity as a young black man finding his place in the world. His grandmother had been the one to suggest he start growing locks when he turned 14. She told him stories about their ancestors, about the power and meaning behind natural hair in their culture. Every few months she'd help him maintain them, teaching him about patience and self-respect along the way. "Your hair tells your story," she'd always say. "Don't let anyone make you ashamed of who you are." Devin had never been ashamed. If anything, he felt proud. His locks made him feel connected to something bigger than himself. They gave him confidence when he walked into rooms where he was often the only person who looked like him. The gate area was packed with travelers. Devin found an empty seat near the window and pulled out his laptop. He wanted to review some of the projects he'd be working on during his internship. The company had sent him a welcome packet with details about the innovative software they were developing. Reading about it made his stomach flutter with anticipation. "Flight 447 to Los Angeles will begin boarding in approximately 30 minutes, came the announcement over the intercom. Devin looked around at his fellow passengers. There were business people in suits typing away on their phones, families with excited children heading to Disneyland, and college students like himself with backpacks and dreams of making it big in California. An older woman sitting across from him smiled. "First time flying?" she asked kindly. "No, but first time flying somewhere this important," Devin replied, returning her smile. "Well, you look like a young man with big plans. Good luck to you." Her words made Devin feel even more confident about the journey ahead. He'd overcome so much to get to this point. Growing up, his family didn't have much money. His mother worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat after his father left when Devin was 12. But she never stopped believing in her son's potential. "Education is your ticket out," she'd tell him every morning before school. "You work hard, stay focused, and doors will open." Now here he was, about to walk through one of those doors. When boarding began, Devin gathered his things and joined the line. He had an economy seat, but he didn't care. He was just grateful to be on this plane at all. The company had paid for his flight as part of the internship package, something that seemed almost too good to be true when he first received the offer letter. As he made his way down the narrow aisle of the aircraft, Devin noticed how cramped everything was. He was tall for his age, nearly 6 feet, and he had to duck slightly to avoid hitting his head on the overhead compartments. His seat was toward the middle of the plane, a window seat that would give him a great view of the country passing below. He settled in, carefully placing his laptop bag under the seat in front of him and buckling his seatbelt. The seat next to him was empty for now, which gave him a little extra room to get comfortable. Devin pulled out his phone to send a quick text to his mother, letting her know he was safely on the plane. About to take off. "Can't believe this is really happening. Love you, Mom." Her response came back almost immediately. "So proud of you, baby. Fly high and remember who you are." As more passengers filed onto the plane, Devin watched the flight attendants go through their pre-flight routines. They moved efficiently through the cabin, checking overhead bins and helping people find their seats. One of them, a woman with short blonde hair and a stern expression, caught his attention. She seemed more intense than the others, checking everything twice and speaking to passengers in a crisp, business-like tone. Devin didn't think much of it at first. Flight attendants had to be thorough for safety reasons. He understood that. He went back to looking through his phone, scrolling through messages from friends wishing him luck on his big adventure. But then he noticed the blonde flight attendant approaching his row. She stopped directly beside his seat and stood there for a moment, looking down at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. It wasn't friendly like the other flight attendants he'd seen. There was something cold about the way she was studying him. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp and commanding. "I need to speak with you about your appearance." Devon looked up, confused. "My appearance?" "Your hair," she said, gesturing toward his locks. "It's not appropriate for air travel. It violates our safety regulations." The words hit Devon like a punch to the stomach. He felt heat rise to his cheeks as other passengers began to turn and stare. "I'm sorry, what do you mean?" "Company policy clearly states that passengers cannot have hair that could pose a safety hazard during flight. Your hair is too long and could get caught in emergency equipment or block other passengers' visibility." Devon felt his heart start to race, but not with excitement this time. This was fear and confusion and something else he couldn't name. "But it's just hair. It's not blocking anything. I can tie it back if you want." The flight attendant shook her head firmly. "That's not sufficient. The policy is clear. You'll need to cut it to an appropriate length before we can depart." "Cut it?" Devon's voice cracked slightly. "But this is my hair. It's part of who I am. I've been growing it for 3 years." "I understand your personal preferences," the woman said, though her tone suggested she understood nothing at all. "But safety regulations take priority over individual styling choices. This is non-negotiable." Devon looked around desperately, hoping someone would step in and explain that this was all a mistake. But the other passengers just stared back at him with expressions ranging from sympathy to annoyance. Some seemed uncomfortable with the confrontation, while others appeared impatient to get the flight moving. "Can I please speak to the captain?" Devon asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," the flight attendant replied coldly. "I've been doing this job for 15 years. I know the regulations. You have 2 choices. Allow me to trim your hair to an acceptable length, or you'll be removed from this aircraft and banned from future travel with this airline." The words hung in the air like a threat. Devon felt trapped, cornered in his seat with nowhere to go. All around him, people were watching this humiliating scene unfold. His dreams of the summer internship, of proving himself in the tech world, suddenly felt very far away. His grandmother's words echoed in his mind. "Don't let anyone make you ashamed of who you are." But what choice did he have? If he got kicked off this flight, he'd miss the first day of his internship. The company might think he was unreliable. His one shot at this opportunity would be gone. Devon closed his eyes and tried to think of what to do. 3 years of growth, 3 years of cultural connection and personal identity, hanging in the balance because of an airline policy he'd never heard of before. The unfairness of it made his chest tight with emotion he was trying hard to control. This was supposed to be the best day of his life. Instead, it was turning into a nightmare he never could have imagined. Devon sat frozen in his seat, his mind racing as he tried to process what was happening. The flight attendant stood over him, waiting for his decision with an impatient expression. Around them, the cabin had grown uncomfortably quiet. Even the usual sounds of passengers settling in and chatting seemed muted. "I need an answer," the woman said, tapping her pen against her clipboard. "We have a schedule to keep." Devon's hands trembled as he reached for his phone. "Can I just call my mom really quick? Maybe she can help explain." "No phone calls." The flight attendant cut him off sharply. "This is a simple matter of following airline policy. Either you comply or you leave the aircraft." A middle-aged man in the seat across the aisle leaned forward. "Is this really necessary? The kid's hair isn't bothering anyone." The flight attendant turned her cold stare on him. "Sir, I'll ask you to mind your own business. This is a safety matter." "What safety issue?" The man pressed. "I've seen people with much longer hair on flights before." "Every situation is different," she replied curtly before turning back to Devon. "Young man, I need your decision now." Devon felt tears starting to build behind his eyes, but he fought them back. He couldn't cry in front of all these people, not when he was supposed to be starting his adult life, proving he could handle himself in the professional world. He thought about his grandmother, about all the stories she'd told him about their ancestors who had fought for dignity and respect. But he also thought about the internship waiting for him in Los Angeles. If he got kicked off this flight, everything he'd worked for would be ruined. "If I let you, cut it," Devon said quietly, hating himself for even considering it. "How much would you have to take off?" The flight attendant's expression softened slightly as if she sensed victory. "Just enough to meet regulations. A few inches should do it, a few inches." 3 years of growth, and she was talking about it like it was nothing. Like cutting off pieces of his identity was just a minor inconvenience. "This isn't right," said a woman in the row behind them. "You can't just force someone to cut their hair." "Ma'am, please don't interfere," the flight attendant said without turning around. "This is between me and this passenger." But other people were starting to speak up now. A young woman with a baby was shaking her head in disgust. An elderly black man further back in the cabin was half standing, clearly upset by what he was witnessing. "This is discrimination," the elderly man called out. "Plain and simple." "Sir, please take your seat," the flight attendant said, her voice rising. "If passengers continue to disrupt this process, I'll have to call security." The threat of security being called made Devon's decision for him. He couldn't bear the thought of being dragged off the plane in handcuffs, his humiliation complete. At least if he went along with this nightmare, he might still make it to his internship. "Okay," he whispered, the word barely audible. "Okay, you can cut it." The flight attendant nodded briskly. "Good choice. I'll get the necessary supplies." She walked away toward the front of the plane, leaving Devon sitting there feeling like he might throw up. The passengers around him were murmuring among themselves, some expressing outrage, others seeming relieved that the conflict was being resolved. The man across the aisle leaned over again. "Son, you don't have to do this. There are laws against this kind of treatment." "I have to get to Los Angeles," Devon said, his voice hollow. "I can't miss this opportunity." "No opportunity is worth sacrificing your dignity," the man replied gently. But Devon wasn't sure he agreed. His whole future felt like it was hanging in the balance. His mother had sacrificed so much to help him get this far. His teachers had written recommendation letters believing in his potential. How could he throw it all away over hair? The flight attendant returned with a small pair of scissors and a plastic bag. The sight of the scissors made Devon's stomach lurch. This was really happening. In front of dozens of strangers, his cultural identity was about to be cut away. "Turn toward the window," she instructed. "This will be quick." Devon turned his head, staring out at the tarmac where ground crew members were loading luggage into other planes. Normal people doing normal jobs, probably never having to choose between their identity and their future. He felt the first touch of the scissors against his hair and had to bite his lip to keep from crying out. The flight attendant worked methodically, cutting away locks that had taken months and years to form. Each snip felt like a small violence, a theft of something precious. "Please be careful," Devon whispered as she worked. "These took so long to grow." "I'm being as careful as I can," she replied, though her tone remained cold and professional. "You should have thought about that before boarding with inappropriate hair." The word stung almost as much as the scissors. Inappropriate hair. As if the way he naturally grew from his scalp was somehow wrong or offensive. Behind them, someone was recording with their phone. Devon caught a glimpse of the screen reflecting in the window and felt a new wave of humiliation. Not only was this happening, but it was being documented. His lowest moment was going to live forever on social media. "Stop recording," the flight attendant snapped at the person with the phone. "This is a private matter." "Nothing private about it when you're doing it in front of 100 people, the person replied. But they lowered their phone. As the cutting continued, Devon felt pieces of his hair falling onto his shoulders and into his lap. Each fallen lock represented memories. The day his grandmother had first twisted his hair, the hours spent learning about his heritage, the confidence he'd built in embracing his natural appearance. Other passengers were getting restless. The flight was supposed to have taken off 20 minutes ago, and people were starting to complain about the delay. Some were angry at the flight attendant for creating this situation, while others seemed annoyed at Devon for not just getting his hair cut before traveling. "How much longer is this going to take?" demanded a businessman near the front of the plane. "Just a few more minutes," the flight attendant called back, continuing her work. Devon closed his eyes and tried to transport himself somewhere else. He imagined he was already in Los Angeles, already starting his internship, already proving himself as a capable young professional. Maybe once he got there, he could start growing his locks again. Maybe this was just a temporary setback, not a permanent loss. But even as he tried to convince himself of that, he knew something fundamental had changed. The confidence he'd built over 3 years of embracing his identity had been shattered in a matter of minutes. How could he walk into that tech company now, knowing he'd just let someone cut away part of who he was? "There," the flight attendant said finally, stepping back to examine her work. "That should meet regulations." Devon reached up to touch what remained of his hair, It felt jagged and uneven, nothing like the carefully maintained locks he'd worn with pride just minutes before. The flight attendant handed him the plastic bag containing the pieces she'd cut off. "You can keep these if you want," she said, as if she was doing him a favor. Devon took the bag with shaking hands, staring down at the disconnected pieces of his hair. They looked so lifeless now, just dead strands in a plastic bag instead of the living, growing expression of his identity they'd been when attached to his head. The flight attendant returned to the front of the plane to continue pre-flight preparations, leaving Devon to deal with the aftermath of what had just happened. Passengers were still staring, some with sympathy, others with curiosity about the aftermath of the confrontation they'd just witnessed. A young woman in the row behind him leaned forward and quietly placed a packet of tissues on his armrest. "I'm so sorry that happened to you," she whispered. Devon nodded gratefully but couldn't trust himself to speak. If he opened his mouth, he was afraid he might start crying and never stop. The plane finally began to taxi toward the runway, but the excitement he'd felt earlier was completely gone. As they lifted off from Atlanta, Devon stared out the window at the city falling away below. Somewhere down there was his mother, probably at work, completely unaware of what her son had just endured. Somewhere down there was his grandmother, who had taught him to be proud of his heritage. What was he going to tell them? How could he explain that he'd let a stranger cut away 3 years of growth, 3 years of cultural connection, just to make a flight? The 6-hour journey to Los Angeles stretched ahead of him like an eternity. Devon pulled out his phone and looked at the last text from his mother. "Fly high and remember who you are." But as he sat there with his butchered hair and a bag of his severed locks in his lap, Devon wasn't sure he remembered who he was anymore. The plane touched down at Los Angeles International Airport 6 hours later. But for Devon, it felt like the longest flight of his life. While other passengers chatted excitedly about their California adventures or business meetings, he sat in silence, occasionally touching the uneven stubble where his locks used to be. As people filed off the plane, several passengers approached him with words of support. The elderly black man from the back of the cabin pressed a business card into his hand. "What happened to you today was wrong," he said firmly. "Call me if you need help. I know people who fight these kinds of battles." The young woman who had been recording gave him her contact information too. "I got most of it on video," she said quietly. "If you ever want to use it, just let me know." Devon nodded and thanked them, but he felt numb. All he wanted was to get to his hotel, shower, and try to forget this day had ever happened. But as he walked through the terminal, catching glimpses of himself in the reflection of shop windows, forgetting seemed impossible. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Hope you landed safely. Can't wait to hear all about your first day tomorrow. Love you." Devon stared at the message for a long time before responding with a simple, "Landed safe. Talk tomorrow." He couldn't bring himself to tell her what had happened. Not yet, not over text message. This wasn't something you shared in a quick phone call while walking through a busy airport. The hotel shuttle ride was a blur of palm trees and unfamiliar California landscapes. Devon checked in, went to his room and sat on the edge of the bed, still holding the plastic bag containing pieces of his hair. The reality of what had happened was starting to sink in, and with it came an anger he'd never felt before. This wasn't just about hair. This was about being told that who he was naturally wasn't acceptable. It was about being forced to change his appearance to satisfy someone else's idea of what was appropriate. It was about having his cultural identity treated like a safety hazard. His phone rang. It was his father. Dr. Robert Williams had been largely absent from Devon's life since the divorce when Devon was 12, but they'd been rebuilding their relationship over the past few years. Robert was a successful civil rights attorney in Chicago, someone who had spent his career fighting against exactly the kind of discrimination Devon had just experienced. "Hey, son." Robert's warm voice came through the phone. "How was the flight? Ready for your big first day tomorrow?" Devon had planned to keep the incident to himself, at least until he figured out how to process it. But hearing his father's voice, something inside him broke. "Dad," he said, and his voice cracked like it hadn't since he was 13. "Something happened on the plane." "What kind of something?" Robert's tone immediately shifted from casual to concerned. Devon told him everything. The flight attendant's demands, the humiliation in front of other passengers, the forced cutting of his locks, the bag of severed hair he was still holding. As he spoke, he could hear his father's breathing become heavier, more controlled. When Devon finished his story, there was silence on the other end of the line for several long seconds. "Are you telling me," Robert said, his voice deadly quiet, "that an airline employee physically cut your hair against your will?" "She said it was safety regulations," Devon replied weakly. "Safety regulations, my ass," Robert exploded. "Son, what you just described is assault. It's religious discrimination. It's racial profiling. It's a violation of about 6 different federal laws." Devon had never heard his father this angry. Robert Williams was known for his cool demeanor in court, his ability to present arguments with calm precision. But this was different. This was personal. "Dad, I just want to forget about it and focus on my internship." "Forget about it?" Robert's voice rose. "Devon, they can't do this to you. They can't do this to anyone. Do you understand what this represents? This is exactly the kind of institutional discrimination that destroys young black men's confidence before they even get started in life." Devon felt tears he'd been holding back all day finally start to fall. "I just wanted to get to Los Angeles. I didn't want to lose my opportunity." "And you shouldn't have to choose between your identity and your opportunities," Robert said, his voice softening with paternal concern. "That's exactly why this can't stand." Over the next hour, Robert transformed from concerned father to crusading attorney. He had Devon describe every detail of the incident again, this time taking notes. He wanted to know the flight attendant's name, the flight number, the names of any witnesses Devon could remember. "I need you to write down everything you remember while it's still fresh," Robert instructed. "Every word she said, every person who spoke up, exactly how many inches she cut, everything." While Devon wrote, Robert was already making calls, first to his law firm, instructing his paralegal to begin researching airline discrimination cases, then to his network of civil rights attorneys across the country, including specialists in transportation law. By the time Devon finished writing his account, Robert had assembled the foundation of a legal team. "Here's what we're going to do," Robert said when they talked again an hour later. "First, I'm flying out to Los Angeles tomorrow morning. Second, we're filing complaints with every relevant agency, the Department of Transportation, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division." "Dad, I don't want this to become a big thing." "It's already a big thing," Robert interrupted. "The moment that flight attendant decided your natural hair was unacceptable, it became a big thing. The moment she forced you to choose between your cultural identity and your future, it became a big thing." Robert's voice took on the passion Devon had heard when his father spoke about his most important cases. "Son, I've spent my career fighting these battles because I believe every person has the right to exist in their natural state, without fear or shame. What happened to you today isn't just about you. It's about every young black person who's been told their hair is unprofessional, unacceptable, or unsafe." That evening, Robert worked late into the night from his Chicago office. He'd built his reputation handling cases that seemed impossible to win, taking on institutions and corporations that thought they were untouchable. This case felt more important than any he'd ever handled, because it was about his son. His research revealed that the airline had no specific policy about hair length for safety reasons. In fact, their own employee handbook showed flight attendants with long hair, some longer than Devon's had been. The safety regulation the flight attendant had cited either didn't exist or had been completely misapplied. More troubling, Robert's contacts in the legal community began sharing similar stories. This wasn't an isolated incident. There was a pattern of discrimination, particularly targeting young black passengers and their natural hairstyles. By midnight, Robert had drafted a formal demand letter to the airline's corporate headquarters. It outlined the violations clearly: religious discrimination under the Civil Rights Act, assault under state criminal law, and violation of the airline's own stated policies regarding passenger treatment. The letter demanded immediate action, a formal apology, compensation for the emotional distress and civil rights violations, termination of the employee responsible, and a complete review of the airline's policies and training procedures. "They have 48 hours to respond appropriately," Robert told Devon during their late-night call. "If they don't, we file suit in federal court." Robert's tone was different now, Not just the angry father, but the seasoned attorney who had taken down corporations before. "Son, I know this is overwhelming. I know you just want to focus on your internship and move forward. But sometimes moving forward means standing up and fighting back. What if they drag this out? What if it affects my internship?" Devin asked. "Then we'll deal with that too," Robert replied firmly. "But you can't let fear of consequences stop you from demanding justice. If we don't fight this, the next young person they target might not have a father who's a civil rights attorney. We fight this for them too." As Robert prepared for his early morning flight to Los Angeles, he felt a familiar fire burning in his chest. It was the same feeling he'd had during his first civil rights case 20 years ago. The sense that this was about more than one person's experience. This was about dignity. This was about the right to exist without having to conform to someone else's narrow definition of acceptable appearance. This was about making sure that no other young person would have to choose between their identity and their future. The airline had made a serious mistake when they decided to target Robert Williams's son. They were about to learn that some battles aren't worth starting, especially when you're clearly in the wrong. By dawn, Robert was on a plane to Los Angeles, armed with legal documents, righteous anger, and the unshakable determination of a father protecting his child. The airline's executives had no idea what was coming their way, but they were about to get a very expensive education in civil rights law. The fight was just beginning, and Robert Williams never lost fights that mattered this much. While Robert Williams was boarding his early morning flight to Los Angeles, something was happening online that would change everything. The young woman who had recorded Devin's ordeal on the plane had posted the video on social media before going to bed, thinking maybe her few hundred followers would find it as disturbing as she did. She woke up to thousands of notifications. Her phone was buzzing nonstop with comments, shares, and messages. The video had been viewed over 1 million times overnight and was spreading like wildfire across every social media platform. The footage was damning. It clearly showed the flight attendant cutting Devin's hair while he sat helplessly in his seat. Other passengers protesting in the background. You could see the tears in Devin's eyes, the shame on his face, and the cold indifference of the airline employee doing something that looked deeply wrong to anyone watching. By 8 a.m. Pacific time, the hashtag Dar Devin's hair was trending nationwide. People were sharing their own stories of discrimination, their outrage at what they'd witnessed, and their demands for justice. The video was being picked up by news outlets, shared by celebrities, and discussed on morning talk shows. Devin woke up in his Los Angeles hotel room to dozens of missed calls and hundreds of text messages. His phone had been buzzing all night, but he'd turned off the volume to try to get some sleep before his first day at the internship. The first message he opened was from his best friend back home. "Dude, you're all over Twitter. Are you okay?" Devin sat up in bed, confused and still groggy. He opened his social media apps and felt his stomach drop. The video was everywhere. His face, his humiliation, his worst moment being viewed by millions of strangers around the world. His phone rang. It was his father calling from his plane. "Son, have you seen the news?" Robert asked immediately. "I just woke up to it," Devin said, his voice shaky. "Dad, everyone's watching. Everyone's seen what happened to me." "I know it feels overwhelming," Robert said gently, "but this changes everything. This video is evidence of exactly what they did to you, and the public reaction shows that people understand this was wrong." Devin scrolled through the comments on the video. Most were supportive, expressing outrage at the airline and sympathy for what he'd endured. But there were also cruel comments, people questioning why he was making such a big deal about a haircut, others making racist remarks about his appearance. "Some people are saying horrible things," Devin said, reading a particularly nasty comment that made his chest tight with anger. "Don't read those," Robert advised firmly. "Focus on the support. Focus on the thousands of people who see this for what it really was, discrimination. This video is going to help us get justice not just for you, but for everyone who's faced this kind of treatment." While they talked, Robert was monitoring the situation from the plane's Wi-Fi. The airline's stock price had already dropped 3% in pre-market trading. Major news networks were calling the airline for comment. Civil rights organizations were issuing statements condemning the incident. The airline's corporate communications team was in full crisis mode. They'd been blindsided by the overnight explosion of negative attention. Their first instinct was damage control. They issued a generic statement about reviewing the incident and ensuring compliance with all policies. But that weak response only made things worse. People saw it as tone-deaf and inadequate. The statement didn't acknowledge wrongdoing, didn't apologize to Devon, and didn't address the clear discrimination that millions of people had witnessed in the video. By noon, protests were forming at major airports in Atlanta, Chicago, and New York. Travelers were sharing photos of themselves canceling flights and booking with competing airlines instead. The hashtag #boycott Skyline Air was gaining momentum alongside Devon's hair. Celebrity supporters began weighing in. Athletes, musicians, and actors with large social media followings shared the video with their own comments about discrimination and the importance of protecting young Black people's right to their natural appearance. One particularly powerful post came from a Grammy-winning rapper who had faced similar discrimination early in his career. "This could have been me at 17. This could be any of our sons. Companies can't keep treating our children like their natural selves or threatening or unacceptable." This ends now. The tech company where Devon was supposed to start his internship called him that morning. The CEO personally reached out to express support and assure him that his position was secure, regardless of any media attention. They also offered additional resources if he needed time to deal with the situation. "We stand behind our interns and we stand against discrimination in all forms," the CEO told him.
"Take whatever time you need.
"Your spot here is guaranteed." That support meant everything to Devon. One of his biggest fears had been that the controversy might affect his career opportunities. Knowing that his dream internship was safe gave him the courage to consider fighting back, instead of just trying to disappear. Robert landed in Los Angeles to find reporters waiting at the airport. Word had gotten out that he was Devon's father and a prominent civil rights attorney. He gave a brief statement expressing his outrage and his intention to pursue all legal remedies available. "What happened to my son represents a broader pattern of discrimination that has no place in modern America," Robert told the gathered media. "Airlines cannot be allowed to target young Black passengers and force them to change their natural appearance to comply with made-up policies." By late afternoon, the airline's executives were facing their worst nightmare. The story was leading newscasts across the country. Their social media accounts were flooded with angry customers demanding action. Travel booking sites were showing customers actively avoiding their flights. Several major corporate customers who had contracts with the airline for business travel were threatening to take their business elsewhere. Hotel chains and rental car companies that had partnership deals were reconsidering their relationships. The airline's board of directors called an emergency meeting. Stock price had fallen 8% since the video went viral. Financial analysts were predicting significant revenue losses if the boycott gained more momentum. The flight attendant who had cut Devon's hair was placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation, but many people felt that wasn't enough. They wanted her fired, they wanted policy changes, and they wanted accountability from the airline's leadership. Legal experts appearing on news shows explained the various laws that had likely been violated. They outlined the potential damages the airline could face in both civil and criminal proceedings. Some predicted this could become one of the most expensive discrimination settlements in aviation history. Robert met with Devon at his hotel that evening, accompanied by 2 other attorneys from his firm who had flown in to help with the case. Devon looked exhausted from the day of media attention and public scrutiny. "How are you holding up?" Robert asked, embracing his son. "It's overwhelming," Devon admitted. "I never wanted this much attention. I just wanted to go to my internship and start my life." "I know," Robert said, "but sometimes life chooses us for these moments. Sometimes we become the face of change whether we planned to or not." They spent the evening reviewing the airline's response and planning their next moves. The airline had reached out through intermediaries, suggesting they might be open to settlement discussions. But their initial offers were insulting: travel vouchers and a private apology. "They still don't understand what they've done," Robert told his legal team. "They think this is about customer service. They don't realize this is about civil rights." Late that night, as Devon finally tried to get some sleep despite the ongoing media storm, Robert was working on a federal lawsuit that would demand not just financial compensation, but systemic change. He wanted mandatory training for all airline employees on discrimination law. He wanted clear policies protecting passengers' cultural and religious appearance choices. He wanted transparency in how discrimination complaints were handled. The video that had started as one person's attempt to document an injustice had become a catalyst for a national conversation about discrimination, dignity, and the right to exist as oneself without fear or shame. The airline executives, sitting in their crisis management meetings, were beginning to realize that this wasn't going to blow over in a few news cycles. This was going to fundamentally change how they did business. They had targeted the wrong person's son, and now they were facing the consequences of their discriminatory practices on a national stage. The reckoning they had avoided for years was finally coming, and it was going to be more expensive and more public than they ever imagined. The storm was just beginning, and it was about to get much worse for anyone who thought discriminating against young black passengers was acceptable business practice. 3 days after the video went viral, the airline faced a crisis unlike anything in its corporate history. What had started as one teenager's humiliating experience had exploded into a nationwide movement that threatened the company's very survival. The boycott was devastating. Passenger bookings had dropped by 40%. Major corporations were canceling their business travel contracts. Airport protests were spreading to dozens of cities. Financial analysts were predicting the airline might face bankruptcy if the situation continued. Robert Williams and his legal team had been working around the clock, and their investigation had uncovered something even more damaging than the original incident. This wasn't isolated discrimination. It was part of a pattern that had been going on for years. "We've found at least 12 similar incidents in the past 18 months," Robert announced at a press conference outside the federal courthouse in Los Angeles. Young black passengers targeted for their natural hair, their clothing, their cultural expressions. "The airline has been systematically discriminating against people who look like my son." The evidence was overwhelming. Internal emails showed employees discussing problem passengers in coded language that clearly targeted people of color. Training materials included vague references to appropriate appearance that seemed designed to give staff discretionary power to harass passengers based on racial bias. Most damaging of all was a recorded conversation between two supervisors joking about cleaning up the cabin by targeting passengers with ghetto appearances. The recording had been made by a whistleblowing employee who was disgusted by what she was witnessing. Devin watched the press conference from his internship office, where his new colleagues had been incredibly supportive. The tech company had even issued their own statement condemning discrimination and pledging to review their own diversity and inclusion practices. "Your courage is inspiring change everywhere," his supervisor told him. "What you're doing matters beyond just your own situation." Devin was beginning to understand that. At first, he just wanted the nightmare to end. But as more people shared their own stories of discrimination, as young black people reached out to thank him for standing up, he realized this was bigger than his personal experience. His phone buzzed with a text from his grandmother. "Proud of you, baby. Your hair will grow back, but the courage you're showing will last forever." That afternoon, the airline's board of directors made an unprecedented decision. Facing mounting financial losses, federal investigations, and the complete collapse of their public reputation, they announced they were temporarily suspending all flight operations. Effective immediately, Skyline Air will cease operations for a comprehensive review of our policies, procedures, and corporate culture, the CEO announced in a hastily called press conference. "We take full responsibility for the discrimination that occurred and the broader failures in our organization that allowed such treatment to persist." It was the first time in aviation history that a major airline had voluntarily grounded its entire fleet due to a discrimination scandal. The announcement sent shockwaves through the industry and marked a turning point in how companies might handle civil rights violations in the digital age. The grounding wasn't just symbolic, it was necessary. The Department of Transportation had launched a full investigation. The Justice Department was considering criminal charges against airline executives. Multiple state attorneys general were filing their own lawsuits. Robert Williams had built an airtight case that went far beyond simple discrimination. He was pursuing charges of assault, violation of civil rights, conspiracy to deprive citizens of their constitutional rights, and corporate negligence. The potential damages were in the hundreds of millions. But this was never just about money for Robert or Devon. They wanted systemic change that would protect future passengers from experiencing what Devon had endured. 2 weeks after the grounding, the airline's leadership team was completely replaced. The new CEO was a former civil rights attorney who had been brought in specifically to rebuild the company from the ground up. Her first action was to reach out directly to Robert Williams and Devon to begin settlement negotiations. But these weren't the insulting initial offers the company had made. This was a comprehensive proposal for change. The settlement agreement was unprecedented in its scope. The airline agreed to pay Devon a substantial financial compensation, enough to cover his education and set him up for life. But more importantly, they agreed to fundamental changes in how they operated. Every employee would undergo mandatory civil rights training developed in partnership with leading advocacy organizations. New policies would explicitly protect passengers' rights to their natural appearance, cultural dress, and religious expressions. An independent monitoring board would oversee the airline's compliance with anti-discrimination laws. The airline also established a scholarship fund for students pursuing careers in civil rights law. With Devon having input on how recipients were selected, they partnered with Black cultural organizations to ensure their policies were developed with community input. Rather than corporate assumptions, the flight attendant who had cut Devon's hair was terminated and faced criminal charges for assault. Several supervisors who had enabled the discriminatory culture were also fired. The company committed to transparency in how discrimination complaints were handled, with regular public reports on their progress. When operations resumed 6 weeks later, Skyline Air was a fundamentally different company. Their new training programs became a model for the industry. Their policies protecting passenger dignity were adopted by other airlines facing their own discrimination scandals. Devon's story had sparked a broader conversation about discrimination in travel that extended beyond airlines to hotels, rental car companies, and other service industries. Laws were introduced in several states specifically protecting people from appearance-based discrimination in public accommodations. A year later, Devon was thriving in his tech career. His internship had led to a full-time job offer, and he was using his platform to advocate for diversity in the technology industry. His locks had grown back, longer and more beautiful than before. He often spoke at conferences and universities about his experience, always emphasizing that change was possible when people were willing to stand up for what was right. "That flight attendant thought she was cutting my hair," he would say in these speeches. "But what she really did was cut away my silence. She forced me to find my voice, and that voice helped change an entire industry." Robert Williams watched his son's transformation with pride. The shy teenager who had just wanted to get to his internship without trouble had become a confident young man who understood his power to create change. Their relationship had been strengthened by fighting this battle together. Robert had given Devon the legal tools to seek justice, but Devon had given Robert something even more valuable, a reminder of why civil rights work mattered so deeply. The airline incident had taught them both that discrimination thrives when people accept it quietly, but it crumbles when people refuse to be silenced. 3 years later, Devon graduated from college with honors and a job offer from one of the biggest tech companies in the world. He wore his locks proudly at graduation, knowing that his grandmother was watching from the audience with tears of pride in her eyes. The plastic bag containing his severed hair still sat in his childhood bedroom, a reminder of the day his life changed forever. But it wasn't a symbol of loss anymore. It was evidence of how far he'd come and how much he'd helped change for others. Devon's story proved that sometimes the most powerful revolutions start with one person refusing to accept injustice. Sometimes changing the world begins with simply insisting on the right to be yourself, exactly as you are, without apology or compromise. The airline industry was forever changed because one teenager decided his dignity was worth fighting for, and one father decided his son's civil rights were worth defending at any cost. Their courage had created a safer, more respectful world for everyone who came after them. In the end, what started as Devon's worst day became the foundation for his greatest triumph. Not just personal success, but the knowledge that his suffering had prevented countless others from experiencing the same discrimination. That was a victory worth every tear, every moment of humiliation, and every difficult day of fighting back. Justice had been served, But more importantly, change had been achieved. And change, unlike individual victories, lasts forever.